Hey gang, just getting a start on my day, my usual kind of work day stuff, um, which involves waking up, making myself and my wife some breakfast, and today it was pouring over Google AdSense stuff, video revenue share settings, that kind of the back end of all of this. Um, and insight statistics, that sort of thing. Um, and it usually I like to do that kind of thing when I'm not quite awake yet because otherwise I get bored. If I'm fully alert and awake, I just can't bring myself to do that kind of thing. So I usually bang it out when I'm in a fairly zombie-like. But wanted to talk to y'all about a couple of things that have been on my mind. Something that has been I have wrestled with this. I've gone back and forth, and on a given day, I have a different answer to these kinds of questions. But something I've wondered about is the degree to which the amount of authorial transparency changes or perhaps even ruins the reader experience of my written work. That I mean, on the one hand, you've got this. On the one hand, you've got this body of written work, largely poetry, um, and on the other, you have the author themselves in some cases telling you their own reactions to it, related concepts to it, or at the very least just reading it. You know, like for most of you, your first encounter with my written work is seeing me read it to you, and that does influence the reaction, the interaction with the work. The voice that you hear in your head when you read a line of verse is deeply personal, and I've wondered if I am somehow spoiling that. And on the other side, like I've commented before, the reader has the experience of a work as a completed object in the world. You know, the process of it is not necessarily um, accessible or transparent to them. Um, and that's certainly not what I've been doing. I mean, um, I've been affording people the opportunity, well, obviously, to hear me read my work, to hear some interpretations of it, um, and in some cases, even to see me putting it together. I mean, like, I know not many of you have availed yourself of my blog TV work cams, but it's very much a live as it's happening documentary of the gears turning. Um, like chewing over a phrase and oh, that's bullshit. Oh, that's shit. That's awful. That's terrible. That's quite good. I think I'm going to keep that. Yeah. And I do talk to myself when I'm working quite frequently. Um, what I've come to in regards to all of that is the idea that maybe what I am offering, what I'm putting out, is not a disruption of the general reader-author experience, but rather something else, is something different. That there is a relationship between the author, with the author, with the work, with the material, with the process of the work, with the way that the work fits into the author's life, that is atypical of a usual author-reader experience. And I can't I can't say whether I view that as a good thing or a bad thing. Um, it's just a different thing. So I've been mulling. I've been mulling that over. Um, this entire process, that transactionality, that perpetual presence of the reader and the interaction with the reader, like the line between fans of my work and friends in my life is very ambiguous. It really is very ambiguous. And I know I have a comparatively small audience, but I feel like I know most of you. You know, it's very rare for me to see a comment on one of my videos or I'll fess up. I do Google myself from time to time, but it's very rare for me to see a mention of me or my work from someone that I know nothing about at all. And like there are around 2,000 of you that are fairly active, and I know at least a little bit about all of you. You know, at least a little about pretty much all of you. And so the relationship is different on my end as well. Like on the one hand, the author is not this for the reader. The author is not this anonymous entity, but and by the same turn, you're not anonymous to me either. Um, and that's for one certainly changed the way that I personally relate to my work, to what I write, because it feels like I am writing for people, not generic people, but very specific people. People, uh, people who have a vitality and particularity of life that is not completely unknown to me, and that's profoundly validating, profoundly motivating, but but also very curious. You know, very curious. There is an odd sort of mutuality of vulnerability in that kind of relationship that I've thought on and fished for kind of a pre-digital precedent, and just come up with nothing. So I think that's very challenging and also very cool at the same time. Um, Another way that this medium has been influencing, well, a little bit of under the hood. Um, I approached the writing of Voldeinsamkeit with a catalog of poems that I wanted to include, and decided I played with that catalog a little bit. I shifted them around a bit, and much of the material, many of the poems in Voldeinsamkeit are reworkings of notes that I had in old composition notebooks. Some of them going back almost, some of them going back better than 15 years. You know, the germ of some of those poems are quite old indeed, very old. Um, but I had this catalog of poems, and I was determined. You know, these are the poems that are going to be included in this collection, and I'm going to shift them around to create kind of a sense of thematic progression from one to the next, and then generate prose text in between to kind of cover the gaps. Um, Sort of like well, like wheelchair ramps. You know, these are kind of devices of accessibility. And from the reactions I've gotten to people who have read Voldeinsamkeit, generally successful. That my typically cryptic poetic voice, particularly again in earlier work, was made much more accessible and much more relatable by the inclusion of those prose passages. My current book in progress is being written almost the opposite way. And what I mean, well, an analogy to connect this to the video making process. Um, the writing process for Voldeinsamkeit is very much like the recording process for my first major batch of poems that I presented here on YouTube. I had a list of poems that I wanted to do in this order, and I would read them and then extemporize off of them. And that's how that recording session came together. The more recent one, the more recent batch of recorded poems, I had an idea of the kinds of things that I wanted to say, the kinds of moods, the kind of feelings, the sorts of concepts that I wanted to convey. And I just turned on the camera, started talking, and when I reached a point in that process of talking where I felt like one of the poems that I already had written would be a good illustrated device, kind of a punctuation for what I was discussing, then I would go ahead and read the poem. Um, and that is very similar to a composition process for Frost from Wings of Valkyries, the book that I'm working on right now, where I am writing long thematic essays. The book is basically structured as 3 long essays with poetic interludes in the essays themselves. And I find it feels like a more natural voice for me. It feels like it has a more natural flow, and I find it very interesting that I would be adopting in my writing a compositional style, kind of a workflow style that I learned in video making. So I think that's kind of cool. And again, those of you who have been taking me up on the blog TV invitations have been kind of had ringside have had ringside seats for the writing of this new book. But those of you who have not are going to have some exposure to that book very, very soon. I've completed the first of those 3 major movements, I guess, in this book. Its first movement is done. It's written. It's text complete, and I've given it my 3 editorial pass process, which feels kind of like debugging. I mean, that's how I conceptualize it. That's how it, the mental approach to the material is virtually identical to the sort of posture that I would take when I was a computer programmer regarding my code. Like run it, see what breaks. Run it, see what breaks. But anywho, I guess the pragmatic upshot of this completely directionless rambling is that I'm going to be posting up a recording of the first movement of Frost from Wings of Valkyries before the rest of the book is complete. Give you a little bit of a taste of what's coming down the pike. And that is some of the poems you have heard before, some of them you have not, and none of the prose have you heard before. So hopefully you'll find that interesting and enjoyable and maybe a little provocative. So, back to the rest of my morning, the far less interesting portions of my morning.